Copic markers are an amazing artist-grade alcohol marker. And even if you don't know much about illustration markers, the biggest selling feature by far for Copics is that they're a lifetime marker. They're totally refillable. But here's the problem. Most people don't refill their Copics often enough. And when you do refill, you do it wrong. You're killing your markers. Today, let's talk about how refilling with the drip method is actually starving your Copic markers to death. Today's video is part 3 of what will be a 4 or maybe even a 5-part series. It's a masterclass on Copic refills and marker maintenance. In the first episode, I showed you how illustration markers stop blending properly long before they squeak or look dry. In the previous video, I demonstrated how to properly refill your Copics. With good care, your Copic markers can live longer than you. So here's the number 1 rule that you need to know about refilling your markers. The only accurate way to refill a Copic is with the help of a jeweler's scale. Wait a minute. We need to buy a scale just to refill a stupid marker? That can't be right, because if I Google how to refill a Copic, or if I search it here on YouTube, everyone's showing how to refill that marker by dripping ink over the chisel nib. Very few people are showing a scale. And look here, they even tell you how many drops you need to do. Why do we have to make everything so hard? 20 drops, maybe 30, or just drip it in one end until it kind of drips out the other end. What did you pay for each of your Copic markers? Too much, I know. And how many of you hit the 2 or 3 year point on your markers and then they started getting crusty, gooey, or they just flat out died? It's because of the drip method. You're killing your markers, drop by drop. In an ideal world, you would always keep your markers at full factory weight. And if you're wondering, Copic sketch markers come from the factory weighing anywhere from 14.6 to 14.2 grams, and it depends upon the color. Maintaining factory weight makes the blending process easier because a full marker is one that's working the most efficiently to smooth your blends for you. But a full marker is also a healthy marker. A marker can last forever if you always replace the ink that you've used after every project. Unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world, and I'm right there with you. I totally understand. It's no fun to refill markers. We avoid doing it until the last possible second. And in the mother of all stupid moves, some people set their dry markers aside and they wait to refill a bunch at once. I'm filming this video in March, and I can tell you the mentions about spring marker cleaning, they're all around right now. But some of your markers are being damaged while they wait. Here's the other problem. Most people, especially beginners, you've been told that you don't need to refill until the marker squeaks or it leaves streaks. There's no gauge on a Copic marker that tells you how empty it is. And since you can't see inside, you can't see how wrong this advice really is. This advice is bad. All over, you'll see tutorials and demos where people recommend the drip method and the 20 to 30 drops. Folks, 20 to 30 drops is laughably low. How low? Well, I ran a marker dry to the point where the marker leaves streaks. Because let's face it, this is really the point where you can no longer procrastinate refilling the marker. Most of the drip tutorials, they show you a very streaky dry marker in the beginning of the video. So I know people are getting the message that it's okay to color until that marker can't color anymore. You color until it dies. Then you do emergency CPR trying to fix it. Okay, so I have a streaky marker. Now let's refill it. But first, I'm going to pop it on a scale so that we can truly understand what's happening as we refill. This marker went streaky at 12.5 grams, so we're about 2 grams below the factory weight. Now let's add 20 drops. The most common recommendation on the internet, 20 drops. It only takes my streaky marker from 12.5 to 12.8 grams. Okay, so let's take it to 40 drops. If we go a full 40 drops, which is actually more than the internet recommends, I'm only at 13.1 grams. This is a problem because Copics do not blend properly below 13.5 grams. 40 drops didn't even get us to a functional level. So I dripped, and I dripped, and I dripped until my hands started to cramp. Folks, it took me 140 drops to return my marker to the low side of factory weight. 140. That stupid 20 to 30 drop recommendation underestimates the amount of ink necessary by 80%. And you'll notice it's always 20 to 30 drops. They never ask you if you're using a sketch, a chow, a classic, or a wide Copic. They all hold different amounts of ink, and they're going to turn streaky at different levels. So how can they all be refilled with the same magical 20 drips? Here's the other problem that new marker fans won't know about. That 20 to 30 drip recommendation, that's been the standard for a long time, like going back to before 2005. But Copic changed their refill bottles in the summer of 2019. The old bottles were made out of a softer plastic, and the old bottles, they also dripped drops just by gravity. So 20 to 30 drops before 2019 was a lot more ink than 20 to 30 drips now. This is dumb. 20 to 30 drops was a wildly wrong random guess, and it spread across the internet like wildfire. It's now commonly accepted as fact, but it's dead wrong. If you're counting drops, you are chronically underfilling your markers. Every drip refill, it's about 1/5 the amount that it should be. If you're only refilling 20% of the marker, we can't even really call that a refill, right? You're not replenishing the marker, you're just giving it a hit to take the edge off. But okay, so what? Even if we're under refilling a bit, it's no big deal. We can always add more ink later. No, this is magical thinking. Copics are not just an open tank where you dump ink. Copics are not empty inside. And there's more to Copic ink than just alcohol. A marker is a machine. It's a complex system. And when you continuously underfill the marker, you're breaking your machine. Inside every Copic is a fibrous core. The core is what holds the ink. The core is suspended inside a hollow, empty chamber. This chamber allows airflow as you color. The nibs, they have a long stem, and the stems insert into the core. They drink ink from the core as you color. The core is the beating heart of your marker, and it's constantly working to keep a consistent flow of ink to both nibs. The fibers in the core, they only care about one thing: balance. So if you use a bunch of ink from one end of the marker, the fibers then shift all the remaining ink around until the entire core and both nibs are balanced again. Everything must be equally moist. You could say that the core is obsessed with balance. Even when you run the marker dry, the core is still going to keep working to find balance. It doesn't care about how much ink it has, it only cares that it's all balanced. This is why both nibs of a Copic will go streaky at the same time. Even if you never use the chisel nib, it still goes streaky when the marker is low. The core always balances the ink so that both nibs always have equal access to whatever amount of ink is available. This is the automatic machine part of the marker. Now, in a perfect world, if you keep the core full and juicy, everything works smoothly, and this can keep working literally for forever. But here's where the system starts to break down. The problem begins with the alcohol in our Copic ink. Alcohol evaporates twice as fast as water. So every time you uncap a Copic, you're losing alcohol. Your marker is even outgassing alcohol while you color. It's just a natural part of the process. But we encourage more evaporation when we leave the cap off for extended amounts of time, if you don't reseal the caps properly, when there's a crack in the marker, or if you follow the silly advice to always color with both caps off. Evaporation is not your friend, and this is kind of why you should have paid attention in science class. When we think about evaporation, we kind of imagine that the ink just, it floats away and it disappears into some magical somewhere, someplace. Where did it go? I don't know. It just all goes away. But that's not what happens. When your marker outgasses or evaporates, only the alcohol evaporates. And I know you know this because we spend most of our time watching ink dry on paper. The color doesn't go poof, only the alcohol. Now, marker ink is made out of two things, alcohol, but also colorant. And the colorant does not evaporate. Copic colorant is interesting. It's sticky and dark and it's kind of gooey. You don't notice the stickiness because your marker only applies a very thin layer of colorant to the paper. But a bottle of pure colorant would be gooey sludge. You know how sometimes you'll open a marker and the nib will be kind of dark on one side, and maybe it leaves streaks when you color? That's a glob of colorant sludge. Your marker machine is breaking down, and you've got a spot on your nib where the alcohol is evaporated, but the colorant has been left behind. It's important to pay attention when you see the sludge because markers, they don't speak English. This is the only way your marker can tell you that something's wrong. Now, most people, when they see this, they blame the nib. Like you'll see tutorials on how to send your nib to rehab or a Copic day spa. They'll tell you how to clean and refresh the nib. Maybe you can give it a massage too. Meanwhile, the poor core in your marker, it's dying of thirst. Fixing the nib or even replacing it doesn't do anything for your core problem. And here's what really stinks. Even if you refill the marker, at this point, by the time you see the damage on your nib, you cannot reverse the core damage that's already been done. Why not? Because Copic knows that you'll get really angry with them if you color a project and then after it's dried, the ink smears whenever you touch it. Colorant on its own is sticky, and it's always going to be sticky. So alcohol inks contain a hidden ingredient, resin. This small amount of resin, it bonds the Copic colorant to the paper. It keeps the color from transferring to other surfaces or smearing. And you've all seen this when you uncap a marker and the nib is hard and crusty. Colorant gets sticky as the alcohol evaporates, but when enough alcohol leaves the solution, the resin steps in and it hardens the colorant. And here's the thing, resin doesn't just get hard, it cures. Curing makes it permanent. Once a nib goes fully hard and brittle, you can't resurrect it by soaking it. I once soaked a crusty brush nib in colorless blender solution for 3 years. Now that was completely on accident because I forgot it was soaking in a jar in my closet. But after 3 years, the nib was still not clean. It was crumbly and totally trashed. Once the resin cures, alcohol can no longer soften it. Now think about this. If a sticky nib is a signal that your marker core has lost a lot of alcohol, yes, because if your nib is getting sticky, that means your marker core is also sticky. So if a sticky nib means a sticky core, what does a hard nib mean? Here's why the drip method kills your markers. You're never giving the marker a refill. You're always just taking the edge off its thirst. But over time, the nibs and the core, they keep outgassing and evaporating alcohol. That's normal, remember? So when you get to a critically low level of alcohol, The core begins to harden and cure, and it happens little by little, slowly over time. A factory fresh marker is using 100% of its core, but when you chronically underfill the marker, little parts of the core start to harden and become unusable. A little patch here, a little patch there, and no amount of new ink, not even a bath of pure solvent, can heal these cured places. So the core keeps on keeping on, trying to make do with 80% functionality, then 75% functionality, then 60%. Little by little, these hard places, they secretly grow larger, and your markers gradually hold less ink. Your poor core, it's like a faithful old dog who's gonna die trying. It'll keep sending ink to the nibs. The nibs are the absolute last place that you'll see the damage. So by the time a nib goes hard, or really even sticky, the core is already terminally ill. And before you ask, no, you cannot replace a core. Copic doesn't sell replacement cores, and in fact, to limit evaporation, they make it darn near impossible to open the marker to even inspect the core. Now here's where some of you will protest. But Amy, I don't count drips. I'm really careful. I drip into one end slowly until the opposite nib starts to look juicy, or until the ink drips out the other end. So, like, I'm really refilling the whole marker. No, you're probably not. The nibs always take priority over the core. So as you're refilling, before the ink fully distributes to all areas of the core, it's going to start moistening the opposite nib. And sometimes, when you refill fast, you can accidentally force ink into the air gap area. And there, it's going to moisten the opposite nib and even leak out the other end. And that looks exactly like a glossy nib and those drip signs you're looking for. Here's the other thing. If you're refilling a core that's, say, only 50% functional, that means 50% of the core is hard. It's never going to hold ink in the hard spots. So of course it drips ink out the other end. You'll never know about the damage, the hidden parts of the core that you're not refilling. The nibs look fine, but half the core is toast. And this is why every once in a while someone tells me that when they first got their markers, they could color for hours, but now they can barely do a single project without the marker running dry. Underfilling shrinks the core over time. Or someone will ask me to double check my weights because they just bought a scale and their markers are totally full and dripping, but they're only 13 grams. When you shrink the core, it holds less ink. Abused and damaged markers weigh less than their new counterparts because damaged cores are half the size they used to be, or less. The only way to keep a core healthy is to keep the marker full. 20 to 30 drops or dripping until your psychic powers tell you that it's full, that's not good enough. The only way to monitor the health of your cores is to refill your markers by weight. If your marker is dripping from one end, indicating that the core cannot hold more ink, but that marker only weighs 12 or 13 grams, that's a damaged marker, and you can't fix the problem. You can only prevent it from happening. Get a jeweler's scale. Refill your markers frequently and always take them back up to at least 14 grams. Stop waiting for a marker to leave streaks, because streaks are a signal of something far worse going on inside the marker. Your core is hardening, and you're letting it happen. Some of you are even encouraging it. You paid a lot for these markers. Treat them like an investment and they'll last a lifetime. Abuse them, and you might as well have bought a disposable marker. If you're not going to refill your Copics, what's the point? For a complete guide to refilling Copic markers by weight, be sure to watch my refill tutorial here. I demonstrate the entire refill process, but I also throw in a bunch of maintenance tips and tricks to keep your marker cores happy and healthy.